a Bible. So get a Bible in your hands and pass it out to people. We're going to be going back into the book of Romans today. We're going to be starting a new sermon series. And we're going to be having our reading now. So it's page 1133, starting at the first verse of Romans 7. So we're going to have a reading, and then Ellen is going to come and speak to us.
Romans chapter 7, from verse 1 to 6. Do you not know, brothers and sisters, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law has authority over someone only as long as the person lives. For example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive. But if he dies, she is released from the law that binds her to him. So then, if she has sexual relation with another man while her husband is still alive, she is called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law and is not an adulteress if she marries another man. So, my brothers and sisters, you also died to the law through the body of Christ, that you might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit for God. For when we were in the realm of the flesh, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in us, so that we bore fruit for death. But now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, and not in the old way of the written code.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Ellen, and I'm a member of the congregation here with my husband Ashley and our 3 children. We've been at Central now for a number of years. We came after university all the way through to now when our own children are coming through the church. So I guess you could say we're old members of the church. And this morning I've got the privilege of beginning our new series in Romans. So you might remember before Easter, we looked at Romans 5 and 6, and that sermon series was called God's Abundant Grace. If you missed any of those, they're on the website, so do go and check them out. Now we're looking at Romans 7 and 8, and we're trying to answer the question, what does it mean to live a life led by the Spirit? So before we get started, just a little bit of context on Romans, so everybody is caught up. It's written by Paul with the aim of unifying the church that was founded in Rome. Now, that church was this melting pot of people. You had Jews who had very established traditions, mixing with people who had no traditions at all, who'd recently come to faith in Jesus. So there was a lot of confusion and conflict around what is the right way to do things. So Paul is writing into this situation, and you could say that Romans is his fullest and most comprehensive explanation of what the gospel is and what it means. And he's aiming to unify these 2 groups together. So here in Romans 7, in this particular passage, Paul is thinking about 2 very different ways to relate to God. You've got the old way and the new way. The old way, which is what his Jewish listeners would have been more familiar with, is a set of rules or a written code, and we'll talk more about that in a little minute. The new way is the way of the Spirit, and that is trust in Jesus and relationship with him. So we're swapping out rules for relationship. Now, there's this concept called love languages. You're probably familiar with it. It's been around for quite a long time. And the idea is that there are broadly 5 different ways in which people can express love for somebody. And people tend to resonate with some more than others. And we also tend to communicate in the ones that we ourselves prefer. So if you want to love somebody well, you need to learn what their love languages are. And those ones are, if I can remember them all, touch, words of affirmation, acts of service, quality time, and gifts. Now, my husband Ashley won't mind me telling you this, but his top two, which are gifts and acts of service, happen to be my bottom two, which is often, I think, what happens. It's a classic scenario. But just imagine for a minute if I had that list of 5 love languages as a kind of checklist. And every day, I kind of went through all of them and ticked them off. I said, yeah, okay, I've given him a hug, I complimented him, I did some admin, I spent some time with him, and I've given him a nice present, job done, all ticked off. And if you then ask me, well, why are you keeping this list? And my answer was, because that's what I'm supposed to do. That is my obligation of being a good wife. I think I'd probably be missing the point completely, right? And I probably actually wouldn't really be making Ashley feel that loved, because rules are very different from relationship. And actually, rules without relationship can feel quite empty. So then, back to the passage we're looking at today. In verses 1 to 3, Paul is giving an analogy for how we're moving from one to the other, from rules to relationship. And he gives this example using the law that surrounds marriage. So there in verse 2, for example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Now, this might seem like quite an involved and technical analogy, but the point Paul is making is that the law's only active over somebody while they're alive, and when they die, it has no hold over them. So in the case of marriage, when both parties are alive, they are viewed a certain way in the law, and they have a contract with each other, and any actions that they do are judged by that contract. And actually, in Paul's example, in the first century, for the wife, she would have relied on her husband for provision and protection. So that contract isn't just about accountability, it's about a whole way of life. Then Paul compares that to how through Jesus' death we are moving from an old contract and into a new one. And we're not beholden to that old one anymore, just like a widow isn't beholden to the law of marriage anymore. It's not just that the rules have changed, it's that the whole operating system is different. In fact, we relate to God in an entirely new way, the new way of the Spirit. So we're just going to spend some time thinking about what this new way of the Spirit actually means. And there's 3 things that I want to cover. First of all, the new way is freedom from condemnation. Secondly, the new way is growing good fruit. And then finally, the new way is serving by choice. So, first of all, the new way is freedom from condemnation. To understand why this is freeing, we need to unpack a little bit more about what Paul means when he talks about the law. So what actually is the law? Well, we might commonly know it as the 10 Commandments. We've actually got them inscribed on a tablet up there, if anyone is interested. That's the law that was given to Moses in Exodus. And you could say that's the backbone that the whole law rests upon. But there are also lots of other laws that we find in the Old Testament, in books like Leviticus, which are kind of detailed and involved instructions about ceremonies and dispensing justice and hygiene and lots of other things. And they could be described as about setting the people of God apart and cleansing them. There are about 613 commands in total. And if you had to summarize all of it, you could say it's rules you follow to be right with God and set yourself apart for him. So are we saying then that the law is bad? Was it like, God had plan A, didn't really work out, puts that in the bin, moves on to plan B? Absolutely not. We're not saying that. It's good. The moral law is actually a divine blueprint for how to live for God well. And even in the ceremonial laws that feel a little bit less relevant for us today, there are principles at work that are really important, like making sure justice happens or looking after vulnerable people in society. And actually later on in the next chapter, Paul says the law is actually how we know what sin is. It's kind of like a moral compass for the whole universe. But there is a problem, and that's what Paul is talking about in these verses. Because we spend the whole of the Old Testament reading about Israel, God's chosen people, breaking this law time and time again, constantly falling short. And this, I think, is what Paul is talking about in verse 5, which is a tricky verse. He says, the sinful passions are aroused by the law. And what he means by that is knowing how we should live doesn't actually mean the human heart is capable of living it. In fact, it actually points out the gap even more. And Paul describes us in this state as people who are controlled by the sinful nature. And just a quick note on terminology there, that phrase, sinful nature, that's sometimes translated as flesh, and it literally refers to our base desires and instincts. So a good example would be when somebody does something to annoy you and you get angry, or maybe somebody needs your help and you do nothing because it's a bit easier. It's essentially what we're selfishly inclined to do. So what Paul is saying is, we know how we should behave and we are held to that standard, but that knowledge actually inflames our base desires even more. And it's not really dealing with the root problem, which is that we're controlled by those desires. And it means that the law actually binds us and we're convicted by it, because the law points us to God, but it exposes the gap between our imperfection and his perfection. But in the new way of the Spirit, we are called to die to the law, as it says in verse 4. It's a bit of a strange phrase until you read the whole verse. You also died to the law through the body of Christ, that we might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead. In the new way of the Spirit, we die to the law that we might belong to another. We're exchanging the written code for the person of Jesus Christ. And because we were not able to fulfill the law, Jesus fulfills it on our behalf. And when we trust in him, he stands in our place and his Spirit dwells within us. Not rules, but relationship. And belonging to Jesus brings with it a whole host of good news. Because when we belong to Jesus, our sin is forgiven. Every falling short of every law, it's removed from us as far as the east is from the west. In fact, God even says he forgets it. When we belong to Jesus, he is judged on the cross in our place. And guess what? He actually fulfilled the law in every way perfectly, no notes. And when we belong to Jesus, we know that he conquered death itself, and we can be secure in that knowledge. This is the grace of the gospel, and this is the new way of the Spirit. That where before the law brought condemnation and made us guilty or bound us up, Jesus, through the Spirit, brings forgiveness and true freedom. Your sin is no longer held against you, and no longer are you controlled by those base desires, because their ultimate hold over you has been broken. But are you living in the right mindset this morning? Because I think it's easy for us to know about the new way, but actually practically be living in the old way. And that might be you this morning if you know Jesus, but you're actually feeling guilty or convicted about your sin. If that's you, you need to know that Jesus stands in your place and your sin is forgotten. You can start again right now, anytime that you need it. Or maybe this morning you're feeling a bit trapped by a particular behavior, you're feeling bound up by something. You need to know that Jesus has defeated sin on the cross, and you can claim that victory over your own battles. So give it to him and ask for his help, and you can do that anytime you need to. So the new way means freedom from condemnation. The new way is also growing good fruit. It's not about striving. It's about letting things grow. Paul makes two references to fruit in this passage, and it's a kind of deliberate comparison between the fruit for death that we find in verse 5, which is pretty stark, and the fruit to God that is produced by the way of the Spirit in verse 4. Now, the thing about fruit is that by definition, it's a byproduct. I'm not completely up to speed with my gardening terminology, but fruit grows as a result of the cycle of plants taking in water and sunlight and reproducing. We can't strive to produce fruit. It is a natural product of God working in us. So when we live in this framework of grace, good fruit is going to arise naturally in our lives. I was trying to think of an example for this from my own life that I could, share from the front of church. And I kept thinking about patience. I'm a very impatient person. It's something that I have discovered about myself. And then I've gone on to have 3 children, which I think is probably not a great idea. And at the moment, my son is going through this phase. He's 3. He's going through this phase of he just won't put his shoes on in the morning. He just won't do it. And I would estimate we probably have to ask him to put his shoes on between 15 and 20 times every single morning. That's been going on for quite a long time now. And I think, reflecting on it, it's probably only about 10% of the time that he's actively being naughty and he knows he's doing a bad thing. Probably about 50% of the time he has no idea what's going on. And there's maybe 40% of the time where he just doesn't like doing things that are boring, so he just does them really, really slowly. But I find it very hard to stay patient with him, especially when it's happening every day. And I have fallen short of God's law many times and got very frustrated. And that doesn't really help anyone at all because, he's a child. But here's the difference when living with the Spirit. I bring that to Jesus and I lay it at his feet over and over again. And I don't bear the guilt of falling short. And I'm also not left alone to try and live up to those standards in my own strength. God's Spirit empowers me and helps me. And over time, God is growing the fruit of patience in me. I am not saying that it is a magic wand. You would see that if you saw me in my house any given day of the week. But what I'm saying is that as I give it to God, I see progress that I wouldn't see otherwise. There are moments where I am able to overcome my impatience. There are moments where I'm given a chance to react differently and to choose differently. And actually, there are moments where I would have reacted with impatience naturally, where I don't anymore. And I can see that progress happening over time. And the thing is that fruit takes time to develop. I think we quite often want things to happen overnight. But although God does do things quickly sometimes, I actually think he more often works slowly and sustainably, like growing fruit. And when I look back at even 5 years ago, I am so much more patient now than I was back then. And when you look at that in the context of my whole life, that's breakneck speed. So are you living in the right mindset this morning? Maybe you are trying to do better in your own strength, and maybe today you need to rest in God's grace and give things to him. Or maybe perhaps you need to give God the time and space to cultivate you. Is there something in particular that he's trying to grow in your life? The new way means growing good fruit. Finally then, the new way is serving by choice. In verse 6, Paul says, we've been released from the law so that we can serve in the new way of the Spirit. And this service he's talking about is voluntary. It's a choice that we make, not because we're beholden, as in the old contract, but because we're free to choose to. God doesn't need our service, and he doesn't judge us by it. But out of the overflow of what God has done for us, we choose to serve him. And the difference of the new way is that God's Spirit dwells directly within us and is at work within us, prompting us through scripture or inward prompts or speaking directly in other ways to shape us to be more like Jesus. It's a dynamic relationship between us and God, a give and take where all the cost is on God's side. Over the years that we've been married, I think Ashley and I have changed each other quite a lot. He's finally convinced me that a bacon sandwich is breakfast food, when I was growing up, a bacon sandwich was always a lunchtime meal, but in his house, it was a breakfast thing. That's cool. I quite like a bacon sandwich on a weekend now, and sometimes I even suggest it. I've got him into coffee, and now he's a little bit too into it, and we have to make it with like special equipment and in a really specific way, so I'm slightly regretting that one. But we've also shaped each other's characters in really deep ways. And that's not happened because we've tried to, it's happened because that is just what arises when you're in relationship with another person. And something similar happens with us and God. We don't change God, but God does change us as we spend time in relationship with him. I once heard this really helpful analogy about trying not to do things you shouldn't do, where it's like you're standing in front of a door and there's a really delicious smell coming from behind the door. And the instruction is, whatever you do, don't open the door and eat the food behind the door. And it's like you could stand in front of that door and try really, really hard not to open it, just ignore the wonderful smell. But it's probably a pretty poor way of doing it. You're probably going to crack. A better way of solving it is if there was another door further along the corridor that had an even better smell coming from behind it. You'd turn away and walk towards the better smell. And I think this is what it means to live by the Spirit. We are constantly choosing to pay attention to a stronger relationship, a better way than the desires of the flesh, a person that we can bring our failings before and know that he will free us from them. But are you living in the right mindset this morning? Maybe you have slipped into serving God out of obligation because you know that you should, or you think that you should, or you need to stay in his good books. But you need to rest in his grace and serve him out of the overflow of that relationship. Or maybe you've stopped paying attention to God's Spirit at work in your life. Maybe this morning you need to ask God what he is saying to you and look for the promptings that he is giving. Or maybe this morning you don't know Jesus. Maybe you're feeling burdened or weary or confused about what the meaning of everything is. Know that Jesus is not about following a set of rules. It is an encounter with a person. And maybe he is reaching out to you this morning. So in summary then, the new way is freedom from condemnation. The new way is growing good fruit. And the new way is serving by choice. We're going to have some songs now and some ministry time. I think there were maybe 3 groups of people that came to me that might want to respond to this message. First of all, people who really need to know freedom, who need to know that they're forgiven and resting in God's grace this morning. Secondly, maybe people who are looking for breakthrough in specific situations. Maybe there's something in particular that's really binding you up today and you need freedom from it. And then finally, people who want to listen to the Spirit more, people who want God to speak into their individual situations. So if one of those groups of people sounds like you, there will be people over here to pray for you in the next song. Please go and seek prayer. Or indeed, if you've got anything else you want to bring up for prayer, then please go and pray with someone. Thank you.
Thank you so